All right, if you're not there, go ahead and join me in the book of John. We're in John chapter 18 this morning. We're still in Kangaroo Court, if you will, right in the middle of Jesus's 6 trials. He had three Jewish trials, 3 Roman trials. We've covered 5 of them up to this point. This morning, we're going to look at the final Roman trial, and let me just tell you, it's a doozy. We haven't seen anything yet. It's incredible the way this trial goes down. There's just some weird things that happen. Let me just name a couple just leading in. When have you ever seen a judge who's convinced of a man's innocence punish him anyway? I've seen judges mess up verdicts or maybe convict an innocent man, but generally because he thinks he's guilty. How many judges actually find someone innocent and punish him anyways? We're going to see that in this trial. When have you seen a judge punish an innocent man so that his accusers will let him go? Let me just punish this guy. He's innocent, but let me punish him so these guys will just let him go, drop the charges. We're going to see that in this trial. We're also going to see something that's very unheard of, and that's for a Roman government official to take a known rebel against the government of Rome, an insurrectionist, and release him. Just let him go. That is unheard of in Roman jurisprudence. We're going to see that this morning. Remember, Pilate is a compromised man at this point. We can't state that enough. We can't bring that context enough because it explains why he makes the decisions that he makes. But one of the things that we want to remind us of, let me just bring this picture up too before I forget it. Kangaroo, I love this picture. It's just kind of cool. It's like Gestapo kangaroos, but that's Kangaroo Court, and it represents what's going on. But one of the things that we've mentioned, it's very important here, is that when you look at Roman jurisprudence or Roman legal philosophy, as it were, that citizens of Rome had more rights than non-citizens of Rome. In fact, non-citizens of Rome were considered aliens, and they really didn't have any rights. And so what we're going to see this morning is the way Pilate treated Jesus, but he didn't violate any legal precedent from a Roman's perspective. It's terrible the way he treated him, don't get me wrong. But he actually doesn't violate Roman law because Jesus is not a Roman citizen. So I point that out going through. So the biggest fault that he has is he's going to allow an innocent man to be condemned. That's where Pilate made the mistake. He didn't have backbone, if you will, to stand for justice. And so Kangaroo Court is still in session this morning as we continue our study. But what's really interesting here is we get to chapter 18, starting in verse 39. You're going to see that Pilate wants to release Jesus, okay? Pilate, this whole trial process, Pilate is actually the only one that's been fighting for Jesus. And he's going to fight all the way till the end when he finally just is out of bullets and like, okay, I can't fight anymore. I'm going to have to turn him over. It's amazing to see this in Pilate as we work through here. Verse 39 says this, but you have a custom, this is Pilate speaking, you have a custom that I should release someone to you at the Passover. Do you therefore want me to release to you the king of the Jews? Then they all cried out again, saying, not this man, but Barabbas. Now, Barabbas was a robber. And so one of the things we see about Pilate, he has just been systematically moving through different decisions of expediency. He's trying to compromise to get Jesus off. He tried to set him free earlier. He said he's innocent. He tried to let him go. That didn't work. Then he heard he was a Galilean. He said, I'll send him to Herod Antipas. I'll try to get him off that way. By the way, Herod Antipas also found Jesus innocent, and he sent him back to Pilate. And now what Pilate's going to do is he's going to remember there's a Jewish Passover tradition. He's like, I'm going to jump in on that, and I'm going to try to get Jesus released that way. By the way, Jesus didn't even qualify for this because Jesus wasn't a criminal. He was not guilty. So it's just ironic. He's going to try to go that route even though Jesus is an innocent man. But he's got this desire to release Jesus that we see here. And it's interesting because Pilate here in John, the text tells us he wanted to release someone. Matthew and Mark actually say that the custom was to release a prisoner. And again, it just points to the weirdness of this whole trial. Jesus is innocent, and yet he's categorized as a prisoner in Matthew and Mark. And this is just an interesting take in how they viewed the whole situation, even though this man was innocent. Now, one of the things we learn in Mark, if we were to go there, and we won't, but it seems like the crowd suggested this to Pilate. They mentioned this custom to Pilate, and it's like Pilate just jumped on it, like, oh, all right, here's another way I can maybe get Jesus released. So he's actually looking for any and every way possible to get Jesus home from this whole event. So I just point that out Pilate. We usually drill Pilate a little bit, and he is a little spineless, but he is making an effort. He's the only one this day that's doing that for Jesus Christ. And so Pilate knew that the religious leaders were all jazzed up about him, right? We know earlier they had told them, we want this man dead. Pilate, suspecting that the reason they feel that way is due to envy, he's revealed all this, but he just assumed that in a normal situation, people would say, okay, hard, fast criminal, bad dude, murderer, insurrectionist, or just a guy you don't like. Which one do you want? And on a normal day, it'd be like, I just want the guy I don't like. I really don't want this crazy man, this murderer released. And this is what Pilate is banking on. And and quite frankly, on a normal day, he would have even never considered releasing Barabbas. And the Jews would have never considered asking for him. But this is not a normal day, and this is what we see through the trials of Jesus Christ. And once again, it's interesting that as Pilate brings him out, he uses, if you see that in verse 39, he uses the title King of the Jews. Again, Jesus is claiming to be the King of the Jews. The Jews didn't want him. There's some irony in this, but Pilate all along the way is poking the bear. You can see these subtle jabs he's making at the Jewish religious leaders. They don't like Jesus. They don't think he's their king, but he just keeps insulting them in these small little ways throughout the process. And here's another one here. But I think in this situation, Pilate saw a win-win. He thought, man, if they'll just go for this is a win-win. Because first, he had pronounced Jesus' innocence publicly. He had said he's innocent, but he's not going to release him because he's innocent. What he's going to do is he's going to try to allow the Sanhedrin to save face, and he wants to now release him based on a custom that appealed to the Jewish people. So he's really trying to manipulate this situation. Again, he's a good politician in that sense. He's trying to manipulate the situation so that he comes out smelling like roses. But what he doesn't expect and what he doesn't understand is that what's going on today is one of the most unique trials. In fact, I would argue it's the most unique trial that he's ever going to have to deal with in his life. He doesn't understand that today is that day, and I think he's going to realize that by the end of the day. But what he doesn't expect is the way these Jewish religious leaders are going to respond. Notice again here, they all cried. The majority of them cried out, speaking in unison. Now, we learn from Matthew 27:20 that it wasn't just the Jewish religious leaders, okay? They had been doing some canvassing. They had been doing some marketing. They had been passing out flyers to the crowd, if you will. And they said, look, if it comes down to this, if Pilate gives us a choice, we want you guys to scream. And you could just see him like with you know how they have live shows now and they have like applause screens for people? It's like, now applause. And everyone's like, oh yeah. This is how they're revving these guys up. But it's not applause. What they're going to do is they're going to say, we don't want Jesus, crucify him. We want Barabbas. And so they had set all this up behind the scenes. In fact, Matthew 27:20 says this, but the chief priests and elders persuaded the multitudes that they should ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus. And so Pilate, again, he's scheming, right? He's trying to get Jesus released. He tries to kind of subtly go past the Jewish religious leaders to the crowd. He didn't know that they had already gotten to them. He thought he was going to force them into letting Jesus be released, but the crowd had already been influenced by their leaders. And so this is what he doesn't expect at this point. And so notice too, and I think this is very telling, they didn't just reject Jesus, they single-handedly called out the name of somebody else they wanted released. We're going to learn later in the account that Barabbas had some co-conspirators, right? Two of them are going to be crucified with Jesus on this day. They were involved in the rebellion. They were involved in the revolt with Barabbas. How come they didn't call out one of those two? How come they didn't call out another one? How come they called out the ringleader, which it appears to be, of the insurrection? Why is that the case? I don't know if I have the answer this morning, but there are some interesting things, interesting potential historical facts, like how that was weird. Interesting potential historical facts. Meaning that there are some people in history that record some facts about Barabbas that may or may not be true. They're not officially agreed upon, but they definitely make for an interesting story as to why they called out this man's name and maybe not the other criminals. And let's look at some of those as we go here. One of the things before we do, we learned that Barabbas was a robber. simply means he deprives another person of his property openly and by violence. This word used actually just describes a violent type robbery. We might say armed robbery in our day. We categorize it that way. This is how Barabbas is described. We're going to learn more about him later, that he was a murderer as well. That he had recently, and this is why he's in custody right now, had instigated a rebellion against Rome. We're going to learn all these things about Barabbas. He was not a good dude, okay? But here's some of those historical facts that I think are interesting and might answer the question, why did they ask for Barabbas directly? Just some things to consider. First, his name. His name, Bar-Abbas. You can see a compound word there in the language. Bar means son of. Abbas, we talk about Abba, father, or, Abba. This is the second part of that word. It means son of the father. Now, that doesn't help us much, but, because isn't every son a son of the father? That's kind of the way that works. Birds and the bees, lesson 101, right? I mean, that's just kind of how it works. But some commentators think that the name may actually be a compounded form of Bar Rabbon. See, it's just a subtle change in maybe the derivation of the word, and that's very significant because that means son of the rabbi. Now that's a little bit different flavor. Son of the father, of course. I mean, every son is a son of the father. But Bar Rabbin, if it's an abbreviated form, maybe he's the son of the rabbi. And if that's true, this would be significant because it's possible that Barabbas was the son of a well-known rabbi, okay? Or at least a well-known teacher. And if that were the case, then all of his criminal activities would have been extremely notorious and scandalous. This is literally the preacher's kid before there were preacher's kids, right? Going nuts. And you've heard the old joke, why preacher's kids are so awful? It's because they hang out with the deacon's kids, and they corrupt them. So that's the truth of how that happens a lot of times, but just kidding. But if he's the son of a rabbi, a well-known rabbi, then think about this. He may be the son of a man who has extreme insight and connections into the Sanhedrin. In fact, Barabbas' dad might be in the Sanhedrin. And so this may explain why they're asking for his release specifically. It may. Again, I don't want to die on that hill, but these are some facts that float around often in history. Also, interestingly enough, it can't be completely verified, but there are reports of this. Some historians have actually said that Barabbas, after he was released, he didn't just run off to safety, that he actually spent some time in the crowd at the foot of the cross of Jesus Christ. And again, I don't know if that's true. There are some historical accounts that will purport that. We don't have any official confirmation of that. But if that is the case, think about this, that as Barabbas looks up at Jesus Christ, he's probably the first man in human history that understood that Jesus died for me, that Jesus died in my place. Oftentimes we will say that the cross Jesus died on was your cross. And that's true. He was paying your sin debt. He was paying my sin debt. But that was doubly true of Barabbas. That cross was designed for Barabbas that day, and Jesus is now on it in his place. So kind of interesting. Again, we don't have an official confirmation of that in history. As I mentioned earlier, another thing that we learn about Barabbas is that he was an insurrectionist against Rome and that he was a murderer. We find this in a couple of places. I just bring those up. Luke 23, 18 and 19. They all cried out at once, saying, "Away with this man and release to us Barabbas, who had been thrown into prison for a certain rebellion made in the city and for murder." Mark 15, 7, and there was one named Barabbas who was chained with his fellow rebels. Again, those are probably the other two. Those were the other two crucified with Jesus. And it says that they had committed murder in the rebellion. And so Barabbas was a bad dude. He was not a good person. Why are they begging for his release when they got Jesus, whom they just don't like? So again, there's a lot of unique things going on during this third trial. And what's ironic, I think, in and of itself, is that they had accused Jesus. The charge that they had brought before Pilate, they had brought many charges, but the one that seemed to stick is that he was an insurrectionist. And their attitude was like, insurrection needs to be punished. That was the Jewish religious leaders' attitude. And now what are they doing? Give us a condemned insurrectionist, free him. but let the one found innocent of insurrection pay the price. So again, everything is backwards here. They are really after Jesus Christ. Now, by the way, Pilate is in between a rock and a hard place, okay? He's trying not to upset the Jews, right? He's under a lot of pressure from the emperor at this point by the way he's treating the Jews. But also think of the decision he's having to make. He is going to willingly let a known insurrectionist, one who has rebelled against the Roman government, who's been convicted of it, caught red-handed, he's going to just let him go free. See, that's not going to sit well with his superiors either. So Pilate's in a lot of trouble. He's got a lot of conflicts going on. And as just a couple of quick background reminders, we'll move through this quickly. Pilate had already found Jesus to be innocent. Herod Antipas had found Jesus to be innocent. He wanted to release him. Okay, this is leading up to this point. We also know that he was personally suspicious of the Jewish religious leaders' motives for wanting Jesus executed. And he had also been warned by his own wife not to have anything to do with Jesus. Like, let him go, get him out of here. We don't want to suffer because of this man. And then also, we know that the crowd had been manipulating, or the Jewish religious leaders had been manipulating the crowd. And so Pilate is now running out of options, okay? He's tried everything at his disposal. He's like, hey, you got a custom, let me release this guy. They're like, nope, not him, give us Barabbas. He's like, oh, great, okay, I'll release Barabbas. But Pilate now has another plan. He's still trying to release Jesus, but it's a backwards plan. It's a weird plan that he goes to next. We're going to see this in chapter 19, but I will say this, it's a plan nonetheless, okay? He is still at this point, although he's going to do some cruel things to Jesus, he is still fighting to release Jesus, believe it or not. It's hard to imagine as we go forward, but if you go to chapter 19, what we're going to see, and we're going to dive into that here in a second, Pilate is going to do something here that he's trying to elicit sympathy from the crowd. And what that is he's going to punish Jesus, and then he wants to release him. He's going to use punishment of Jesus, mockery of Jesus, embarrassment of Jesus as a way to elicit sympathy to release Jesus. This is his game plan. This is his Hail Mary. Okay, we're in football season, right? So this is his Hail Mary, and it really sets the stage for this third Roman trial. Now, to set the stage, look at this. I've kind of underlined it for you, but in Luke 23:16, and then we jump to 20 and 22, Pilate says this, I will therefore chastise him, okay, that's scourging, and release him. Notice again, what's his end goal? He wants to punish him in order to release him. Verse 20, Pilate therefore, wishing to release Jesus, again called out to them, but they shouted, saying, crucify him, crucify him. Then he said to them the third time, why, what evil has he done? I have found no reason for death in him. I will therefore chastise him and let him go. So again, Pilate's last-ditch effort, he wants to get Jesus going home. So this punishment of Jesus, in Pilate's mind, is actually a gracious way to get him going, to set him free. This is Pilate's reasoning here. And this is what we read in verses 1 through 3 of chapter 19. So then Pilate took Jesus and scourged him. And the soldiers twisted a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put on him a purple robe. Then they said, Hail, King of the Jews. And they struck him with their hands. Okay, so we start to see this punishment of Jesus. He scourges him. Okay, we've heard a lot probably over the years about scourging, but it was you were whipped, you were beaten severely by a whip, or you were flogged. And one of the things that we need to understand is that this was a typical Roman custom. Okay, this was how Rome punished or beat criminals as a form of punishment. But one thing that's interesting that doesn't come out a lot is they would actually use this method of abuse as a means of examining a suspect. Okay, so they're trying to figure out, is the guy telling the truth? Does he know more than he's letting on? Is he naming his conspirators? Let's just scourge him as an enhanced interrogation technique, right? To get more information out of him. So sometimes they would do that. But when they did it as a tool of examination, they would actually, it wouldn't be as hard as the final stage of flogging. Okay, so we'll talk about that in a second. But just to show you this enhanced interrogation technique, where it's also mentioned in the Bible, we jump to the book of Acts, Acts 22. Paul is under really guard from the Jewish people. They're trying to kill him in the temple. The Roman guard has stepped in, trying to figure out who's telling the truth. And this is what ends up happening. The Roman commander decides this. He ordered him, Paul, to be brought into the barracks and said that he should be examined under scourging. This is that enhanced interrogation step or technique that we're talking about, so that he might know why they shouted so against him. And as they bound him with thongs, Paul said to the centurion who stood by, "Is it lawful for you to scourge a man who is Roman and uncondemned?" See, Roman citizens had rights under Roman law. He was not allowed to scourge a Roman citizen that had not been condemned. Jesus doesn't fit that category. He's an alien, right? He's a non-citizen, so Pilate can do anything he wants to him, including scourging him in order to let him go. Now, Pilate wasn't using this scourging to further examine Jesus. How do we know that? He's already declared him righteous twice. He doesn't think he's guilty. He's not trying to find out more from Jesus to convict him. He is literally just trying to elicit sympathy from the crowd. Now, historically, one of the things we need to understand, and I think this is very helpful as we kind of walk through this whole passage concerning Jesus, at least the details of it, that there were three forms of Roman flogging that the Romans administered. And I think it's important to recognize these because as you look at the timeline of Jesus, it appears that Jesus is actually going to be scourged twice. Now, I in all my study over the years, I had never heard that before until I started studying through the details and looking at the timeline. But it appears, along with Roman culture and what we read in the scriptures, that Jesus was actually flogged twice. Now, we'll talk more about that. But the first type of flogging, this enhanced interrogation technique, trying to get more information, was called the fustigatio. Anybody know Latin? You can correct me later. You can send me an email. Fustigatio, I think that's how it's pronounced. It was the light whipping. Okay, it was a lighter scourging, not the kind that we typically hear about it in the scourging of Christ, because he is going to experience the really bad kind too. That's going to be in the future. At this point, I think this is where he's at, the fustigatio, this lighter form of scourging. The second form is the flagellatio, which was a severe flogging that criminals who were guilty of more serious crimes received. And then third, the verberatio was the most brutal. Worst criminals got this, and this was always a lead up to crucifixion. This one went with the lead up to crucifixion. And so, very important. This is the third one where Jesus eventually got this one. But I believe here, where we're at in John, he gives him the first one. And again, it's to elicit sympathy. He went ahead and beat him, went ahead and gave him the examination scourge, but he wants to let him go at this point. Okay, so this happened before the sentencing of Pilate. All right, and so again, the entire goal of this scourging was what? Pilate said what the goal was. I'm going to scourge him so I can do what? Release him. Later, he's going to say he's going to scourge him so that he can crucify him. That's when he moves to the third version, I believe, of this scourging. And so Jesus, I believe, received the third type of flogging after his sentencing. So he received one before the sentencing. That was the lighter form, which we're looking at in John here. He's going to receive the heavier one after his sentencing. And let me just pull that up for you, Matthew 27:26. Again, notice the steps here. Pilate is no longer thinking about releasing Jesus when he scourges him the second time. It says, then he released Barabbas to them, and when he had scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. Not, he tried to release him again. Okay, so this is a second scourging. So Pilate, Mark 15:15, wanting to gratify the crowd, released Barabbas to them, and he delivered Jesus after he had scourged him to be crucified. And so this may have been, by the way, now that we know that, if that's true, if what I'm saying is true, if that's an accurate accounting, it may explain why the religious leaders remained unsatisfied. They're like, you barely hit him. Come on, that's not enough, right? They gave him a lighter scourging. They're like, that's nothing. Oh, yeah, you put a crown of thorns on it. You hit him a couple times. Oh, come on. Like they weren't satisfied with that. We're going to see that they're not satisfied when Pilate is done with him. And so this third type of flogging, I just want to talk about it briefly, and we'll talk more about it when we get further in the story. But it's really tragic. You know, the Romans were creative in how to torture people. They were just like really good. They were probably, you know, the originator of terrorists. You know, they were very creative on how to torture people. But their flogging or scourging involved a leather whip with multiple strands, and then embedded at the end of the strands were either rocks, bones, or pieces of sharp metal. They were designed to penetrate the victim's skin, and then as they pulled it out, it would drag through the skin. It would hit blood vessels and bones and muscle tissue underneath the skin, and then they would just insert it again and pull it out again, and insert it again and pull it out again. So you would get somebody who was just completely beaten and bruised, both externally and internally. This is kind of a mock-up of what a Roman scourge looked like. You can see they've got lead balls in there, lead spikes. They got sheep bone shards and other pieces. Now, you can imagine many prisoners didn't even survive this type of scourging. This alone killed many people. It was just too brutal. They would bleed to death. They would break bones. They would shatter vertebrae. All sorts of things would go on. Now, we often read about the 39 lashes in Scripture, right? You could only give 40 lashes, and so the Jews would say, well, let's just give 39 in case we miscount. We don't want to break the law, so we just stop at 39. The Romans didn't have any restrictions. They could just go as long as they want. And so you could see they became experts on how to torture somebody to within 1 inch of their life and let them live. They became experts at that because they did this all the time. And so, again, as I mentioned, Jesus probably didn't receive this type of scourging at this point in the narrative, but he will receive this as we go forward. Now, moving forward here, one of the things that we know about Jesus, and as we've watched this lead up, none of this surprised him. He called that this was going to happen to him. He predicted all of that we've been reading through. He predicted. Matthew 20, 18 through 19 reads this. Behold, this is Jesus speaking. We are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and to the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him to the Gentiles to mock, and then notice that, and to scourge, and to crucify, and the third day he will rise again. You know, it's just a fulfillment of prophecy. Isaiah 53:5 says, but he, speaking of the Messiah, was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement for our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. We're going to see another verse in Isaiah 50. I'm going to pull it up here in a little bit. We're going to see that the Messiah offered his back. That's literally what it says. Offered his back to those accusing him. And this is exactly what we see in the scourging. And so this is just amazing. Again, an innocent man, publicly declared innocent, now suffering in this way. And then we see that the soldiers twisted this crown of thorns on his head, and then they put a purple robe on him. Twisted mean they braided it. They probably took a thorny plant, maybe a local date bush. They've got a lot of thorns there in Israel. Braided it together in the shape of a thorn or a crown, and then they put it on his head. Now, they put it on his head. It's possible they just rested it on there. But typically, if you've ever put a hat on somebody, especially little kids, what do you try to do? You try to get it down a little bit so it doesn't just fall off. And so it's probably what they did. And that's typically depicted when you look at passion plays or movies or pictures of Jesus, where they take this crown of thorns and they push it down into his skull with the thorns to keep it there. And typically you'll see him bleeding from those wounds. But that's probably what they did. They probably dug it into his head. Okay, so again, this isn't all pleasant. You know, Pilate is definitely punishing him. But again, he's trying to do it in such a way, I think, to elicit sympathy. I keep going with that as his motive because he wants to release him. The other thing that we see is immediately after they crown him, these men began to take sticks, or they called reeds, and they began smacking him on the head, beating him on the head with these reeds as well. We read that in Matthew 27. But when they had twisted a crown of thorns, they put it on his head. Then they spat on him and took the reed and struck him on the head. We also see that they put a purple robe on him. And we've always heard, this was interesting too in my study, we've always heard that purple is the color of royalty, and that's true. It is a color of royalty. Because his charge was that of being king of the Jews, it was used to sarcastically mock him, right? How are kings usually treated? I mean, they're treated with kid gloves, right? They're put on a throne. They're not beaten. They're not mocked. They're not treated this way. So they're mocking him, but it really accomplished two things. And Pilate is allowing all of this to happen. We don't see Pilate directly involved in this, but he's allowing his soldiers to inflict this type of shame on the Lord Jesus. And one of the things that it did is it mocked the Sanhedrin because it presented Jesus as their king, and they had already rejected him as king. In fact, they're going to say it explicitly going forward. In fact, you guys know the phrase, but they're going to say, he's not our king, and then they're going to say the most ridiculous thing ever to come out of a Jewish person's mouth, which is, we have no king but Caesar. Remember, they're going to say that? And then they're going to say, may his blood be upon our heads and our children's heads. They're going to say that eventually. This is how desperate they are to get Jesus killed. So he's mocking the Sanhedrin by allowing this, but they're also mocking Jesus as a purported Jewish king. And one of the things I found interesting just in study is that the purple color was a color of royalty, but it was also a color of vassal royalty. In other words, when the Roman Empire came in and took over cities, they would allow people to remain in leadership roles there, but they still had to pay tribute, and they were subservient to Rome. And the idea is, by putting Jesus in a purple robe, they're still saying, I'm in charge. Rome's in charge. This is your king. Look, he's wearing vassal royalty colors, meaning he's under us. We've got him completely subdued. This is what the Roman Empire is saying here as they are mocking Jesus in these areas. Then they said, "Hail, King of the Jews." They struck him with their hands. So not only was their mockery verbal, it was also physical. We see that Jesus here is struck with their hands. We learn in other accounts that he was struck with a reed. We kind of looked at that a second ago. And then also from additional other gospel accounts, they kneeled and bowed their knee before him. So they were physically mocking him, verbally mocking him, just setting him up for complete, almost every form of abuse you could imagine Jesus is now experiencing at the hands of Roman soldiers. And man, with friends like that, you don't need enemies, do you? I mean, Pilate's literally trying to get him released, and he's having him treated this way. Also, we learned at this time that they spit in his face. Okay, that obviously that wouldn't go over well in our day, but especially in the first century, that was a show and a form of belittlement, right? You're mocking somebody by spitting in their face. It's most likely where they also pulled hair out of his beard. We have that prophesied about in Isaiah 56. Again, that was something that I didn't even realize until years ago, that Jesus actually had hair pulled out of his beard. And those of you that have beard or facial hair, you can imagine how painful that would be. So all of this is going on probably at this time. Isaiah 50 verse 6 says this. This is the verse I mentioned earlier with the scourging. "I gave my back to those who struck me, and my cheeks to those who plucked out the beard. I did not hide my face from shame and spitting." And so if you, again, this prophecy, by the way, 600 years before the time of Jesus Christ. Just amazing. Isaiah 53, 600 years before the time of Jesus Christ, predicting stuff to a T. It's just amazing. But as you sit here and you picture everything that's prophesied about Jesus, you can just see our Savior getting beat, bludgeoned, and just standing there with his head up. He's not cowering. He's not trying to get away from them. He's not running. He is literally giving his back to them. He's giving his cheeks to them. He's not hiding his face. He's taking it. He's taking all of those blows, head held high, because you know what? He knows what waits on the other side of the cross, right? Hebrews 12. For the joy that was before him, what did he do? He endured the cross, despising its shame. And guess where he's at as a result of that? He's seated at the right hand of God. That's what Hebrews 12 tells us. So all of this is going through the mind of Jesus, but he's not backing down. He's taking these blows. In fact, as you look at the Greek behind these phrases, they said they struck, it's in the imperfect tense, meaning they kept on saying, they kept on striking him. This wasn't a one-off event where they said it once and then they just were just manipulating him mentally, just verbally assaulting him, physically assaulting him, and this was a continual thing. You know, there was an old excavated pavement that archaeologists found at the fortress of Antonia, where this took place. And it was a description of the games that Roman soldiers would play with prisoners as they awaited their execution. Just all these games to mock the prisoners. And one of the games that they found on these excavated pavements was a game called the King's Game. That's what they called it. It had a name. They called it hey, let's play the King's Game with this prisoner. And this King's Game is they would dress the prisoner in royal attire. They would mock them. they would physically assault them. And that's exactly what they're doing with Jesus here. They're playing the king's game that we have verified in history. And it just showed their contempt for any political challenge that anyone might try to raise against Rome. So we have Pilate's decision, and now Pilate is thinking, okay, we bludgeoned him now. We're going to present him, and the Jewish leaders are going to say, okay, he's had enough. Let's just let him go. But we're going to see that's not what happened. So we've got this just man presented in verses 4-5. Pilate then went out again and said to them, behold, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no fault in him. Then Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate said to them, behold the man. And so he presents Jesus now to the crowd. Again, you'll notice there that Pilate, in verse 4, he went out again. We looked at that back in 1828, right? The Jews are so full of hypocrisy that they're willing to break every rule in the book to get Jesus executed, an innocent man, but they won't go into the presence of a Gentile for fear that they defile themselves for Passover. You talk about majoring on the minors. And it's exactly what religious hypocrites always do. And so we see it presented here. So Pilate's going in and out to update them on the situation here. And Pilate clearly states that he finds no fault in Jesus. He's said this a million times now. In fact, he sounds like a broken record. He uses a Greek word there for no, it's oudes. It means not even one, not even the least, not even the smallest bit. This is his legal rendering now. He literally is saying, I cannot find one little thing wrong with this man. That's what he's saying. You guys want to kill him. I can't even find anything wrong with him. Pilate may have thought Jesus was weird. He may have thought he was talking about weird things and verbalizing things, but he was like, he is not an insurrectionist. I don't find anything wrong with this man. Now, it's amazing that a judge could believe that wholeheartedly and still allow what we just read about to happen to Jesus to happen. But that shows you a little bit of the character of Pilate. He was a brutal man, right? We learned about that a few weeks ago. So he's allowing this gross mistreatment of Jesus. And then Jesus came out, and Pilate said to them, behold the man. Here's his official presentation. Behold, I would say, the innocent man. And so this presentation, this is Pilate's last hope of presenting Jesus to get him freed. He was beaten. He probably looked pathetic. He looked pitiful to the average human eye. And I think Pilate's hoping, gosh, just have some sympathy for the guy. Okay, I've beaten him for you. I've taken care of him. I've punished him. Just let him go. And I remember even growing up in school a couple times. I don't know if you guys grew up. Probably many of you did. Had a bully. Maybe you had a bully in your life. And I remember one time I came around the corner and the bully that I didn't like, he had gotten jumped by 3 or 4 different guys, and they were beating him pretty good. He wasn't responding too well. And then they ran off because they didn't want to get caught. And I went up to the bully, and I thought I was really going to enjoy, like, seeing him bleeding and bloodied and hurt. And dude, my heart went out to the bully. I mean, it's like you see someone mistreated that way. You see someone hurting, and oftentimes your heart just goes out to him. This is what Pilate is hoping is going to happen to the Jewish religious leaders. And so in that sense, it's a noble effort on the part of Pilate. It's a little backwards. It's a little weird. We probably wouldn't have handled it. But this was his last-ditch effort. It's not going to work. And by the way, it is interesting to point this out, but Pilate here says, behold the man. What did John the Baptist say earlier? Behold the lamb. And it's interesting. You've kind of got these juxtaposed against each other here. 2 different men viewing the same man with 2 different perspectives. I think Pilate is saying, look at this pitiful, beaten, broken victim. And John the Baptist was saying, look at our victorious Savior who's going to die for you and do something that nobody could do before, and that's to take away the sin of the world. And so it's just kind of interesting as you compare those or contrast those 2. Now, what Pilate is running into, and he doesn't know at this point, he's about to find out, I think he's suspecting at this point, it's this rabid mob. Okay, they've been convinced, they know what they're going to say. They've been stirred up by the leaders, and we read in verse 6, therefore, when the chief priests and officers saw him, they didn't cry, right? Oh, man, he looks terrible. We feel terrible for him. They didn't cry. They cried out, saying, crucify him, crucify him. In essence, what you've done is not enough. You need to finish the job. Pilate said to them, you take him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him. And a couple interesting things here as we look at this verse. There was no sympathy for them. They were literally, it's like their appetites got whetted for more. They saw blood, they wanted more blood. Just seeing the blood they saw wasn't enough. And by the way, it's interesting because for many years, Jewish people would judge the Roman gladiatorial contest in the Colosseum. But this is the exact same human response that we see in the gladiator matches that we see now in the Jewish religious leaders. These are religious leaders. And they want blood. They want more blood. They want Pilate to finish and do their dirty work for them. And they were judging Roman gladiators and the people of Rome as gladiators were on their last leg, and they would look, and the emperor would be, doing this like we've seen in the movies, right? Yeah, go ahead and finish him. Now I'll give him mercy, what have you. And this is exactly what they're doing. This is exactly what mankind wants. If you threaten my power, if you threaten my money, if you threaten my position, I'm going to kill you. That is mankind to its best. That is what mankind has to offer. And this is why when people are climbing the ladder in work and climbing the ladder in other places, they don't care whose head they're stepping on. Because it's not about other people at that point, it's about me. And if someone's got to get bloodied for me to get there, well, the more blood, the better, right? Get them out of my way. And this is their attitude here. In fact, crucify him, crucify him. They couldn't just say it once. They repeat this back to back of what they wanted Pilate to do. And mark this down. This is interesting. They go to a second person singular word here, pronoun here. Pilate, you crucify him. You crucify him, Pilate. We want you to do it, Pilate. Singular. And this is why I think Pilate says, you want me to do it? Y'all do it. I'm not doing it. He's trying to distance himself. In fact, we'll see later that he washes his hands, right? He tries to wash his hands of the whole matter. He doesn't want to be held accountable. And so again, as I've mentioned, they had actually worked the crowd up. So this is a mob type scene for Pilate. It's exactly what he's been trying to avoid, right? He's already in trouble with the emperor. He's trying to avoid this mob type scene. He's trying to stay below the radar with the Jews. And every time he turns around, he's getting put in situations that it's going to cause problems for him. But you can see that Pilate's getting frustrated with them. And it comes out in his statement. I think you can see this frustration in Pilate's wording there in verse 6. He's like, y'all want me to do it? No, y'all do it, right? You guys, all y'all do it is kind of the idea. Now, what's really funny about that is he says again, Jesus is innocent. Look at what he says. For I find no fault in him. He just keeps saying this. He's a broken record. He can't say it more publicly than he's already said it, but they will just not listen to him. And what's ironic about telling them to go and crucify him themselves is it's basically Pilate telling them to take a hike, okay? Because they can't crucify him. They're not legally able to kill anybody. We saw that, back in 1831, let alone kill someone by crucifixion. That wasn't what Jews did, right? Remember, how did Jews kill people when they violated their law? Stoning, okay? It's through stoning. So they couldn't crucify him. They couldn't kill anybody. Pilate is basically just super frustrated with them, and he's just had enough. He's like, I'm not crucifying him. Y'all do it, right? It's kind of the idea here. So had Pilate had some intestinal fortitude, it was at this point, this should have been the end of Jesus' trial. This should have been the end of it. He should have released Jesus. He should have given him to his disciples, let him go home and recover. This should have been the end of it. But we're going to see that the Jews refuse to give up. In fact, the Jews are going to start now dancing back into their original charge. They're just reaching for something to get Pilate to finish the job. We're going to see how they do that here in verse 7. And they're going to say something to Pilate that I don't know if they knew it would have the impact, but it frightens Pilate. They're going to tell Pilate something, again, and trying to manipulate the situation that's going to frighten him. And we're going to see that in verses 7 through 9. It says this, the Jews answered him, we have a law, and according to our law, he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God. Therefore, when Pilate heard that saying, he was the more afraid. And he went again into the praetorium and said to Jesus, where are you from? But Jesus gave him no answer. So what law was the Jews talking about? We'll talk about that in a second, but you notice how they're bouncing back and forth? I thought the charge was insurrection. I thought the charge is he was a king. I thought the charge is he was, stirring up the people against Rome. Now they're like, no, because of one of our laws. Okay, so they're bouncing back and forth. The only thing they're sure of is they want Jesus to die. That's the thing that they're sure of. So they're trying to do anything and say anything to get their way. They want an end result they're working on. Again, what law did he violate? Blasphemy. This was a capital offense because Jesus had claimed to be the Son of God. They viewed that as Jesus saying that he was God or equal to God. But it's really interesting when you look at the laws of the Old Testament and you look at blasphemy specifically in Jewish culture, the offender actually had to say or speak the name of Yahweh. That had to be part of the charge of blasphemy. Jesus had not done that. He had alluded in their questioning, if you remember that, he had alluded to the fact that he was the Son of Man, okay? That he was going to be the one coming to establish a kingdom. So he had alluded to the fact that he was divine, but he had not invoked the name of Yahweh in these official proceedings. And so they didn't really even have a basis from a Jewish point of law to convict him of blasphemy, but they knew exactly what he was saying. Now, I want to just look at this text, and I don't expect you to write this down. I can give you this list. Here's a careful comparison of all the charges that the Jews tried to press against Jesus up to this point in time. This is what I would say is all the jello they've thrown on the wall, right? We talked about that. Anyone been in a food fight, right? It's kind of, it's not, never mind. We got kids available. I remember one time I got some spaghetti to stick on the wall. Now, I don't know if it's because I threw it hard. It was what that spaghetti was made out of in the school cafeteria. But anyways, when you're throwing stuff against the wall, like charges, you're just throwing as many as you can to see what will stick. And this is exactly what they did. Notice first they charged him with threatening to destroy the temple. Second, with being a malefactor or a criminal. Third, with perverting the nation. Fourth, with forbidding to give tribute to Caesar. Fifth, with stirring up all the people. Sixth, with being a king. And then seventh here that we see, making himself the Son of God. So they're just trying anything and everything to get him convicted. Therefore, when Pilate heard that saying, when he heard the fact that Jesus claimed to be the Son of God, notice that it says he was more afraid. What does that indicate? He was already afraid at this point. This made him more afraid when he heard this. And so he was already a little bit concerned. It may have been because of his wife's dream, her verbal warning. He may have been concerned because he had just released or was going to be releasing Barabbas, and he wondered how that might come back down on his head, especially if Barabbas got another rebellion going and killed more people in the city. He probably sensed that this whole situation was not going well. Have you ever been in a situation where you just know, like, however it turns out, you're going to get the blame for it? I think Pilate's feeling that, right? So he's got a little bit of fear, probably for his position, but now he finds out that Jesus claims to be the Son of God. Now, that makes him a little bit more afraid because as a Roman pagan polytheist, he had no problem believing in many gods or the sons of gods. That was all part of their theology. But he also knew enough from his thinking that he didn't want to cross anyone that could potentially be a god. They viewed that people could be demigods, partially divine, partially human, but that they had supernatural powers. And so now he's like, well, wait a minute. If Jesus is a son of God, he's one of these demigods, maybe he's going to take revenge on me, because I haven't really treated him very well. And so now he's kind of concerned. He's a little bit of afraid of who Jesus is. And then we see he asked Jesus, where are you from? Jesus gave no answer. Where are you from? Saying, who are you? Where are you claiming to be from? Who are you really? Kind of thing. But Jesus gave him no answer. Now, Jesus is going to answer him in verse 11. Okay, so it's not that Jesus stays completely silent going forward, but he does remain silent for large portions of his trial, which is a fulfillment of Isaiah 53, describing the Messiah. Also, I think that Jesus is very strategic at this point. Pilate is right there on the tipping scale, I think, of just acquiescing to the Jewish religious leaders or letting Jesus go. And I think at this point, if Jesus had offered any kind of convincing defense for himself, Pilate may have found enough backbone to let him go. And guess what? I don't think Jesus wants that at this point. In fact, I would know biblically Jesus doesn't want that because he is not fighting for his release. We've got to see this in the account of Jesus Christ. He is not fighting to be released. He is fighting to perform the work needed for you and I for salvation. That's what he's fighting for. That's what he's keeping his eyes on. And so he wants to go to the cross. He is willingly choosing to go to the cross for you and for I. And so when he speaks again in verse 11, he's just going to provide some real-time commentary for Pilate on what is happening behind the scenes. Pilate thinks that he's in charge, and Jesus is going to say, well, no, Pilate, you're actually not. And quite frankly, the people that turned me over to you, they've committed the bigger sin. So Jesus just kind of lets him know what's going on behind the scenes. And so I'll tell you what, we'll tie the knot there this morning. We'll pick back up there next week. Let's close with a word of prayer. Lord, thank you for just this incredible narrative, historical section as we just consider the trials that you underwent for us, the sham trials that you faced. And Lord, as we come out, just that last point there where you willingly did this, you willingly stepped in, you were not trying to get yourself released, you weren't trying to protect yourself, you were willingly facing this penalty that you did not deserve, but that we did. And Lord, we cannot say thank you enough. We cannot say that we're grateful enough, but we praise you for that. We look forward to praising you 1,000,000 years from now in eternity for the same reason and on into the ages. We pray in Jesus' name, amen.